The dream of fusion energy has always sounded like something just out of reach. Clean, limitless power without the downsides of fossil fuels or the dangers of nuclear waste. And for decades, the world's brightest minds have been chasing it. Governments have invested billions in ITER, a colossal machine being built in southern France. $50 billion to be exact, plus decades of effort and scientists from all over the globe. You'd think with that much money and brainpower, the lights would already be on. But ITER is still years away from producing a single watt of usable electricity. And that's where Helion comes in. An American startup claiming it can beat ITER to the finish line by a wide margin. They say they'll be generating fusion electricity and selling it to the grid by 2028. That's not just ambitious, it feels almost reckless. You can't help but wonder, if governments have been struggling for half a century, how is a private company going to leapfrog them in just a few years? And, well, that's exactly what this video today is about. It's about the real story of Helion, what makes them think that they can stop the 30 years into the future curse, and why does this race matter not just for the science of fusion, but for the future of energy, climate, and possibly even civilization itself. Just before we keep going today, this video is brought to you by our friends over at Squarespace. What is Squarespace? Well, it's an all-in-one platform for building a website, building a store, showing off a portfolio, whatever you're doing online, you can do it with Squarespace. Look, I've been using Squarespace for years. They first started sponsoring me God knows how long ago. It was a long-ass time ago. I built my website with them, and it was insanely easy. And now it's even easier because of Blueprint AI, which basically, it says, hey, what's your site about? And you're like, it's about this. I'm Simon. Can you make me a website? It's like, yeah, sure. Here you go. Here's a draft. And then you just pretty it up. You fix the text, bada bing, bada boom, and it's done. It's insanely easy. And if you want to make some tweaks, it's all drag and drop. It's just very easy. I don't know what else to say about it other than it's just very, very easy, which is obviously what you want. Plus, the built-in analytics show what people click on so you can see what's worth keeping and what's just kind of sitting there doing nothing. And if you want to share extras like behind-the-scenes files or research notes or whatever you're into, you can add member areas which turn your site into a small community. So if you've been meaning to get your work online, head to squarespace.com/megaprojects for a free trial. When you're ready to launch, use the offer code megaprojects to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's episode. What is fusion and why is it hard? Now, when people hear the word nuclear, most think of fission, splitting atoms apart. That's how every nuclear power plant works today. You take heavy atoms such as uranium, you split them, which releases energy in the process. It's powerful, but it's also messy. You end up with long-lived radioactive waste, and you always carry the risk, however small, of a meltdown. Fusion's the opposite. Instead of splitting heavy atoms, you fuse light ones. That's the kind of reaction that powers stars. Hydrogen atoms smash into each other, stick, and release incredible amounts of energy. Ideally, it is the perfect energy source. No carbon emissions, no meltdown risk, no centuries of radioactive waste. Just clean power, with the main byproduct being helium, which is the same harmless gas that you find in balloons. It sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? Which is why people have been chasing it for more than half a century. Making atoms fuse on Earth is far harder than you might think. The fuels themselves are tricky. Most designs rely on two isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. Deuterium is abundant, so you can literally pull it out of seawater. Tritium, on the other hand, is scarce and radioactive, so reactors have to breed it inside the machine itself using lithium. Another option is helium-3, a cleaner fuel with fewer neutron problems, but it's rare on Earth. People sometimes joke about mining it from the moon, which tells you how impractical it is. And then there's the physics. To get a fusion, you need to overcome the natural repulsion between positively charged nuclei. That means temperatures of more than 100 million degrees Celsius, which is several times hotter than the core of the sun. Containing that plasma, which is essentially a soup of charged particles, is where the real engineering nightmare begins, because apparently we weren't there already. Scientists have a few ways of measuring progress, and the most famous is Q. That's the ratio of energy out to energy in. A Q of 1 means the fusion reaction produced as much energy as it took to sustain it. A Q of 10 means you're getting 10 times more energy out than you put in, which is the level you need to make commercial power a real possibility. But Q alone doesn't solve the problem. You need to hold the plasma steady for a long time. And it can't just be hot for a split second. Power plants require continuous and reliable operation. Some systems pulse their plasmas, others aim for a steady burn. But either way, you have to manage the materials around the plasma. Usually, neutrons produced in the reaction are absorbed by the reactor walls, which in turn makes them brittle and radioactive. So even if you get the physics right, you still need materials that can survive years of that sort of punishment. None of this stopped scientists from trying early on. In the 50s, fusion was a hot bet. Z-pinch machines, devices that tried to squeeze plasma with bursts of electric current, looked like they might deliver quick results, and for a while, people thought practical fusion power was just around the corner. But the plasma proved unstable, constantly collapsing before any meaningful energy could be extracted. By the 70s, one design pulled ahead: the tokamak. Developed in the Soviet Union, it uses a donut-shaped chamber and a combination of magnetic fields to trap plasma. Tokamaks still dominate fusion research today, from small experimental reactors to ITER itself. They've achieved record temperatures, record confinement times, and steadily improved performance. But still, no tokamak has ever produced net electrical energy. Now, if you've ever wondered why people joke that fusion is always 30 years away, it's because every time there's a breakthrough in fusion, it's always followed by new obstacles and revised timelines. And yet nobody has given up, which brings us to ITER. If fusion is the holy grail of energy, ITER is kind of like the cathedral that's been built to house it. ITER is the world's flagship attempt to solve fusion in one massive leap. It was built in southern France and is an international collaboration among Europe, the United States, Russia, China, Japan, India, and South Korea, all pooling resources, technology, and funding. Its price tag now exceeds $50 billion, and its size is about 23,000 tons of machinery. ITER's goals are just as big in size. It isn't designed to be a power plant. It's more a demonstration machine, and its central premise is to achieve a Q of 10. That would make it the first machine to truly create a burning plasma. A burning plasma means the fusion reaction produces so much energy that it sustains itself, no longer requiring constant external heating. ITER is also supposed to test tritium breeding systems to integrate technologies that could later be transferred into actual commercial reactors. In other words, ITER is the standard bearer, the project that, if successful, will prove fusion is more than a scientific curiosity. It will demonstrate that the physics works, that engineering challenges can be effectively managed, and that humanity can realistically plan for future fusion power plants. Unfortunately, ITER has been perpetually delayed. Its original schedule had it producing first plasma years ago now. The new milestone has been pushed back to 2030. Actual deuterium-tritium operations, the real fusion fuel mix, may not happen until the mid-2030s. Add in cost overruns, construction challenges, and the sheer difficulty of coordinating dozens of countries, and it's no surprise ITER has become both a symbol of hope and of frustration. And yet, you can't simply write it off. If it succeeds, it will settle arguments that have been raging for decades. It will show fusion can work at scale, and not just for seconds at a time, like in lab experiments. For governments, it remains the best opportunity to prove the concept beyond a doubt, but it also creates space for the audacious claim of companies like Helion. Because when people look at ITER, with its vast budget, decades of construction, and a timeline stretching into 2030, they wonder if there's a faster way. Helion, what they claim and how they work. Helion was founded in 2013 in Redmond, Washington. Its co-founders, David Kirtley and Chris Pill, both have backgrounds in plasma physics and propulsion. And they set themselves apart from the outset by building Helion to sell electricity rather than just proving that fusion works, as ITER aims to do. Fast forward to today, and Helion has raised more than $1 billion from backers like Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, along with big players like Mithril Capital, Capricorn Investment Group, and Y Combinator Alums. The valuation exceeds $5 billion, which is essentially unicorn territory for a company whose product doesn't even exist yet. But then again, isn't that the story of most disruptive startups? You sell the vision before you sell the product, don't you? In 2023, the company signed a power purchase deal with Microsoft, promising electricity from fusion by 2028. But let's pause for a second here. We're not talking of an MOU or even a let's explore letter, but an actual commercial agreement for electricity from a reactor that doesn't yet exist. That's almost like paying for a meal at a restaurant that hasn't even been built yet because the chef is still experimenting in the lab. But then again, it's Microsoft. They run some of the most energy-hungry data centers in the world, and if fusion works, it would be like finding gold under their server farms. So, maybe it does make sense to lock in early. Helion calls their upcoming machine Polaris, and it's supposed to be the first in the world to not just achieve fusion, but actually generate net electricity delivered to the grid. They plan to achieve this by being as different as possible from ITER and other large fusion projects, starting with the shape of their reactor. Helion uses something called a field reversed configuration, or FRC. Picture two blobs of plasma being fired at each other from opposite ends of a linear chamber. As they collide, they merge into a single plasma ball, which is then squeezed tighter and tighter by massive magnetic fields. The compression drives up the temperature and the pressure until fusion reactions ignite. Their choice of fuel is also unusual. While ITER uses a deuterium-tritium mix, Helion aims for a deuterium and helium-3 mix. And that's so out of the box because, as we mentioned, helium-3 is scarce, and like we said before, it's pretty impractical. According to them, helium-3 is the better choice since it produces fewer neutrons. Neutrons make reactor walls brittle and radioactive, so reducing their presence makes the reactor easier to maintain and cheaper to operate. It's a gamble, but if it works, it's a clever way to sidestep one of fusion's nastiest engineering headaches. The most fascinating part of all of this is that they plan to convert the plasma's energy directly into electricity without the traditional thermodynamic method of spinning turbines and heating water into steam. If it works, it would certainly make fusion more efficient. However, many physicists point out that Helion has yet to publicly demonstrate net energy from any of its machines. They've built and tested 7 prototypes, each more powerful than the last, but none have achieved that net energy that they're looking for. It's one thing entirely to achieve fusion reactions, which Helion has, but another thing entirely to sustain them at scale and actually extract useful power. Still, the company is promising. Its valuation is in the billions, and it's one of the very few private fusion startups with a major corporate customer on the hook. The question, however, is whether we're watching the rise of fusion's first commercial player, or if this is just another chapter in bold promises that are just out of reach. Helion's challenges and risks. Before anyone gets too carried away with Helion's promises, let's pause for a bit of a reality check, shall we? Because the physics, the engineering, and the timelines are all packed with more uncertainty than Helion's slick pitch suggests. Let's start with the physics, shall we? Helion's entire approach rests on FRCs. Imagine a smoke ring of plasma, only instead of drifting lazily through the air, it's a 100 million degree cloud of charged particles trying to tear itself apart. Helion's trick is to form 2 of these plasmoids, smash them together at high speeds, and then squeeze them with magnetic fields until fusion happens. It sounds elegant when you imagine it, but anyone who's worked with plasmas will tell you they're slippery, unstable, and unpredictable, and keeping them confined is like trying to hold jelly with rubber bands. Helion's trick is that instead of trying to hold plasma steady like a tokamak, they fire it in independent short bursts. That avoids the problem of keeping it stable for minutes at a time. However, it also presents a different challenge where every single burst must work. If the plasma doesn't compress tightly enough, the reaction just fizzles before it can make any useful energy. And then there's the fuel. Helion's big selling point is helium-3. It's a rare isotope that doesn't throw off nearly as much damaging neutrinos as the standard deuterium-tritium mix. That's good news if you want a reactor that lasts more than a few years before the walls start crumbling. But helium-3 is rare. Most of the usable supply comes from tritium decay, a very slow process, or tiny amounts of it in natural gas. Helion claims that they can generate helium-3 in the reactor itself as a side reaction when deuterium atoms fuse. But that's still unproven at scale. It sounds like building a car that can run on fuel you promise the car itself will produce once it's running. Might work in principle, but it is easy to see why physicists are a little bit skeptical about this one. And then there's the pulsed system itself. Continuous reactors such as ITER aim for a steady burn, similar to keeping a campfire going. Helion, by contrast, fires in bursts, like a car engine, just with really a lot higher stakes. That means you need precise timing, high power capacitors that can discharge energy in microseconds, and electronics that can withstand the abuse. How long those components last? Nobody knows. It's one thing to fire off a few hundred shots in a lab, it's another to do it day after day for years without the system tearing itself apart. And let's not forget the neutrons. Helion's pitch is that by leaning on helium-3, they avoid the destructive neutron flux that makes tokamaks so hard to maintain. But in reality, side reactions still generate neutrons. Not as many as ITER will have to deal with, but enough to cause the materials to degrade over time. So the no neutron problem claim, it's not entirely honest. It's more like a smaller neutron problem. But look, physics is only half the battle. Even if Helion nails the plasma stability and their capacitors hold up, they still have to build and connect a power plant. And this is where the romance of startups crashes into the brick wall of bureaucracy. ITER benefits from government backing and frameworks that treat it as a scientific project. Helion, meanwhile, has to navigate permits, environmental reviews, safety regulations, and grid integration like any other power plant. If you've ever followed the permitting battles for wind farms or transmission lines, you know how easily these projects can get bogged down. And then we come to the timeline, 2028. This date can either be a curse or a blessing for Helion. Deliver electricity by then, and they will be hailed as visionaries who leapfrogged the world's biggest science project. Miss it, and they'll join the long line of fusion promises that never quite materialized. Experts think that Helion's undertaking is high-risk, aggressive, and ambitious to the point of absurdity. And they do have a point. Building a novel reactor, proving it works, getting it licensed, and hooking it up to the grid in the space of 5 years? Most conventional nuclear plants take longer than that just to clear paperwork. Even if Helion's physics works perfectly, the logistics alone could trip them up. And there's the risk that if Helion misses their date, it would sour public opinion on fusion even further. Investors might become more hesitant, and governments might become more skeptical. And try to move fast, Helion could inadvertently set the field back. Rivals, politics, and global stakes. Helion's not alone in chasing fusion. In fact, it might not even be fair to call them the frontrunner, because the race is a lot more crowded than most people realize. The headlines often focus on ITER, but on the private side, there's a whole ecosystem of startups, each convinced it has found the shortcut to the energy of the stars. Take Commonwealth Fusion Systems. They spun out of MIT, and their machine, Spark, is based on the same tokamak design as ITER, but it's miniaturized and supercharged with high-temperature superconducting magnets. They raised billions on the promise that their reactor would be smaller, cheaper, and online faster. It's sort of like they were saying, yes, ITER is building the jumbo jet, but we're going to build the private jet version. And then there's TAE Technologies in California. They've been at it since the 1990s, burning through more than $1 billion in funding. Their approach is a field-reversed configuration, a cousin to Helion's idea, but optimized for proton-boron fusion, a fuel that doesn't produce neutrons. And that sounds almost too good to be true, doesn't it? Clean, aneutronic power, no radioactive waste. The catch, though, is that you would need temperatures north of 3 billion degrees Celsius. Putting it mildly, that's a lot, and they're still working on it. General Fusion, backed by Jeff Bezos, who wants to smash plasma with pistons, literally compressing it in a liquid metal sphere. It's a bold concept, though it sometimes feels like one of those ideas that sounds great in a TED talk, but faces nasty engineering headaches in reality. And then there's First Light Fusion in the UK, which uses projectiles to shoot at targets for inertial confinement. Essentially, fusion by bullet. Again, it makes you pause. Is the physics going to line up, or is it destined to be just another promising demo that never scales? Now, what is striking is that everyone is playing the same game, but with completely different sets of rules. One is a centralized, multinational bureaucracy throwing decades and billions of dollars at the problem. The other is a swarm of private firms chasing a first-mover advantage. And this is where things get even more interesting, because whoever cracks fusion first will also gain a significant advantage. Access to an energy source that's abundant, carbon-free, and not tied to fossil fuels or unstable supply chains will pull a lot of geopolitical muscle and grant an edge politically. The US wants to lead. Naturally, billions are flowing into American startups, and the Department of Energy is increasingly getting cozy with the private sector. China, on the other hand, is investing heavily in tokamaks, trying its best to build machines at breakneck speed. Their East reactor has already set world records for plasma duration. Europe's betting on ITER, with France hosting the world's fusion gamble on its soil. Japan, too, has its own program, though theirs is less flashy and more methodical. So the fusion race isn't just hype, it's very real. And it reminds us of the space race in the 60s, with probably higher stakes, because while space was about prestige and exploration, fusion is about energy security. Whoever nails it first won't just plant a flag, they will hold the keys to the world's energy future. So let's imagine for a second that Helion, or maybe one of its rivals, actually pulls off fusion in the next decade or two. What would the world look like? Well, the first giant change is obvious: climate. If fusion becomes a real baseload power source, the carbon maths would change overnight. There would be no long-lived radioactive waste, no risk of meltdowns, and no concerns about uranium enrichment. Instead, we'd get power, clean and steady, with none of the headaches that turned Chernobyl and Fukushima into household names. We also have to wonder what would happen to the oil states. If you're Saudi Arabia or Russia or any country whose budget depends on hydrocarbons, fusion's an existential threat. Oil markets are affected when EV sales tick up by just a few percentage points. Imagine what happens when a city can flip a switch and draw all the energy it needs from a compact fusion plant. That would mark the beginning of a collapse and a total shift in power. Whoever holds the patents, the supply chain, and the manufacturing capacity wouldn't just be selling power plants, they would be selling sovereignty, because a country that controls fusion exports controls the future of energy. It happened with semiconductors. Look at how much leverage Taiwan has over the global economy because of TSMC. Now imagine that, but for the thing that powers every home, every data center, every factory. And let's talk economics for a second. If power suddenly becomes cheap and effectively limitless, what industries are unlocked? I mean, AI is the obvious one. Data centers are already consuming electricity at terrifying rates, and entire states are rethinking their power grids just to accommodate server farms. Fusion could turn that into a non-issue. The same applies to industries such as steel, aluminium, and cement. These are some of the hardest sectors to decarbonize, and fusion would make them clean by default. And there's also a human angle. What happens to the parts of the world that are still underpowered? Villages without reliable electricity, hospitals running on diesel generators. If fusion is modular enough, small enough, and could plant reactors anywhere from remote communities to mining operations, and even on ships at sea, for the first time in history, abundant energy wouldn't be limited to where you were born or whether your government could build a power plant. That is going to be revolutionary. And then there are the spillovers. Every time we pursue something ambitious, we often end up with unexpected benefits. The space race gave us GPS, satellite communications, and other science breakthroughs. The Manhattan Project, as destructive as it was, brought with it nuclear medicine and modern computing. Fusion is already pushing advancements in capacitors, superconductors, plasma physics, and solid-state switching. The truth is, even if we never develop a commercial reactor, the technologies will still bleed into other industries. And if we do get it there, the spillover could rival the internet. Of course, fusion's success would also reshape the finance industry. If Helion or any other startup crosses the finish line first, we can expect an investment boom like we've never seen. Trillions would flood into the sector almost overnight. Skeptical governments would scramble to subsidize, regulate, and inevitably weaponize the technology. That's the sobering part. An energy revolution of this scale wouldn't just make the world cleaner, it would also increase rivalries. There's a very slim chance that whoever gets to control fusion would want to share. In the real world, limitless energy is also limitless leverage. Would the US really just hand the keys of a working reactor to every country? Would China? Or would fusion plants become bargaining chips in a new kind of Cold War? So yeah, if Helion succeeds, it's the dawn of something extraordinary, a climate solution, an economic reset, maybe even the first step toward a multi-planetary future. But it also means rewriting the rules of political, industrial, and military power. Verdicts and what to watch. So after all that, where's it leave us? Is Helion actually going to power a Microsoft data center by 2028, or is this just another entry in the long line of fusion is almost here situations? Now, if we're being honest, the right answer is probably somewhere in between. On the one hand, Helion has done more than just talk. They've raised over $1 billion. They've convinced Microsoft, a company that doesn't exactly gamble its cloud infrastructure on pipe dreams, to sign a purchase agreement. They've hit technical milestones like producing plasma at over 100 million degrees Celsius, which is no small feat. That's the kind of physics benchmark fusion researchers usually celebrate with champagne. But hitting 100 million degrees in a test shot is one thing. Sustaining it, confining it, and actually turning it into net electricity, that is quite another. And we have to think back to all those promises that fusion scientists have made over the last 70 years. Every decade, someone says we're 20 years away. Maybe Helion finally breaks that curse, or maybe 2028 is just the latest in a long string of hopeful dates that slip quietly into the rearview mirror. Thank you for watching.